Thanks to the group that I called the rejected elect, I guess somewhat tendentiously, because I wanted to emphasize that God's election, as we find it in Romans 9 to 11, is not somehow incompatible with rejection, but God actually chooses precisely those who the world sometimes rejects, but even those who have endured God's judgment. And that's finally the case with Jesus himself, who is the elect of the elect, you might say. And instead of identifying himself only with the righteous or the obedient or the faithful, Jesus identifies himself with the unjust, being sent in the same form of sinful flesh, as Paul said in Romans 8, and enduring a death that the law describes as a curse, as Paul teaches in Galatians. So that should complicate our notion, I think, of what election is about, what it's for. And you all have given some, I think, good, just brief responses here. I know your plates are full to the material for this week, wading through some chapters of mine. Thankful for that. I guess in response to what you all have written in the two forums, especially here in the second forum, I want to, I think, address a couple things that I just think need to be emphasized and not missed, and also speak to one issue that I think I got wrong in the chapter of the book that I had you guys read. So the first issue that I just think needs to be emphasized is that Israel is Israel, whether they're faithful or not, obedient or not, in the Old Testament. And I don't think that changes in the New Testament. And so Paul's point right there at the beginning of chapter 9 is not that these relatives whom he's just called Israelites, saying theirs is the sonship, et cetera, are not in fact Israel, as if there were that sort of distinction, but instead that because they are Israel, and not just people who might be able to trace their past Israel in some sense, as other non-Israelite peoples can, such as the Ishmaelites or the Edomites or others, because they are Israel, because they found themselves bearing the name, the calling of Israel in the world, they are a witness to how God's election has held them together, now even in the midst of a season of unfaithfulness or disobedience in relation to the gospel. So that, I think, sets the argument on the right sort of footing for us to track with it. And then when you get to chapter 10, verse 9, that many of you commented on, and I think made some good observations about, it's not that Paul has suddenly shifted to talking about, what people need to do to get saved. It's not that that might not be implicit in some way, but his concern is still with the relatives of his that are in view, that are hostile to the readers, and addressing the relationship between them. That is the concern. And so I think that what he is showing is not some general formula for how to be saved, but instead how the recipients of the letter of non-Jewish background have found themselves caught up in God's salvation. It's something that God has done in fulfillment of the word in the law, bringing the word near to their hearts, their lips. And that makes salvation something that's a gift, not a basis for boasting or thinking of themselves as better than these relatives of Paul's, or for blaming these relatives of Paul for that matter. So the way that the passage continues there in chapter 10, if you follow it, Paul then starts asking these rhetorical questions. How will they hear if they have not had someone sent to them? And then he goes on to say, have they not heard? And then he calls upon a psalm that indicates that they and the rest of the world have heard. It's not a matter of not hearing. So the point is not that, these recipients of the letter need to go proclaim the gospel more loudly or something like that to these relatives of his instead. And that's what he goes on to say in chapter 11, which we'll have for this next week. The reason or the way that he wants the recipients to interpret the hostility of these relatives of his is a dullness that has come to them from God, that is itself a manifestation of God's ongoing election of them, God's choosing them into being, you might say, and a promise, therefore, that dulling is not the end of the story, but part of the dynamics by which the recipients have found themselves gathered into the family and will then make Paul's relatives jealous so that they come to participate in the blessings that were promised to this family as their own. So that, I think, is how that Romans 10:9 kind of fits in the flow of the argument. And the key there is just to see that we have to interpret, I think, what he's saying to the recipients of the letter as part of his addressing this issue of his relatives that are in view and how they relate to the audience, how the audience of the letter relates to them. If we lose sight of that, then I think we'll attribute all kinds of things to those words that are not really the point. And that brings me to something that I think I got wrong in that chapter. And that's this, and it's maybe not super easy to explain, but I'll try to say it as concisely as I can. When Paul in 9, sort of the 9, 27, 28, 29, 30, and especially 30 through 33, starts talking about his relatives in view, using words from the prophets, from the books of Moses as well as Isaiah, talking about the stubbornness of the people of God, how Israel did not attain the justice that was promised to them because they pursued it as if by works. In trying to sort of wrestle with what Paul means by Israel in those specific verses, I, in the chapter that I had you guys read, interpret it to be describing a tendency of the Israelite past that is attested by the books of Moses, the prophets, and that the relatives of Paul that are in view are now reflecting. And I don't think that's quite right, because I think that even when Paul says Israel has not pursued that promised justice, or not reached that promised justice because they pursued it as if by works, he's basically talking about his relatives. He's not talking about Israel in general in any sense. Obviously, we know that the argument goes on to show that Paul and others like him are unlike his relatives because they have not been pursuing the justice promised Israel as if by works, but have come to enjoy it by faith. So we can't say that it's some kind of generalization for how all Israel has gotten it wrong, because there's plenty in Israel who have not, Paul being a representative of them. And so I think what's happening there is that Paul is kind of using the way that Israel appears in certain books of the Bible as a way of describing, understanding what's happening with these relatives of his in view. And you might say, in that sense, using the biblical character of Israel to talk about his relatives as a particular expression of Israel that he's addressing that corresponds to this presentation of Israel in these books of the Old Testament. I think where I went wrong was attempting to generalize what the law or the prophets say about Israel as kind of diagnosing some condition or tendency of Israel in the past. And I just don't think that's justified. And I think it loses sight of the fact that when Paul is talking about the difficulties of Israel, He's talking not about the difficulties of all Israel or the difficulties of Israel in the past. He's talking about these relatives of his. So that I think is a better interpretation of the end of chapter 9 there, and just generally how Israel functions as a scriptural term that can be used to describe Paul's relatives in view. Now, Yu-Hui, you asked some great questions that I wanted to make sure I responded to. And one of them is about who these Israelite relatives are. And as I say in the chapter, as well as the podcast, if you listen to that instead, I think all we can say is that they are some Israelite people, probably Jews, that are perhaps well known to Paul and known to the readers. We don't know how many of them there are. I don't think he's talking about all of Israel that's not Christian. I think that Israelite life and the smaller part of that, that's the Jewish life, is diverse, full of ambiguities, and it wouldn't make sense to reduce the relatives that he has in view to something like all of Israel that's not Christian. He's talking about specific Jewish people known to the people that are in Rome that he's writing to. We don't know how many of them they are. We don't know that they're the majority of something. We just know that they're relatives of Paul's according to the flesh, as he says. So I think that's all we can say. But you're right, Yu-Hui, to see that there's certainly probably some correspondence between some of the Jewish figures that we read about in Acts or the Gospels and the people that are relatives of Paul that he's talking about. And there, it probably is good for us to note that those characters in the Gospels and in Acts are typically authorities. When they're enemies of the gospel, it's not some kind of general Jewish tendency or characteristic of all Jews who are not Christian. It's specifically Jewish authorities that clash with Jesus so directly in the Gospels, that drag Paul and other apostles or part of his team before Roman authorities in Acts. And so I do think we could probably try to work out a correspondence there, but it's good to remember that we're not talking about some general tendency of Jews, but something that is predominant among Jewish authorities. Your first question, Yu-Hui, is about, you say, as we understand according to the flesh in 9:3, and the way that I sort of presented in the chapter, can we also understand the same phrase that way in 4:1? And that's a great question. And there's some tension in my own mind about how to hold these together. And we could add to this that Paul has presented Jesus as the son of David according to the flesh in the opening lines of the letter. And I guess I would say that we want to find some kind of consistent way of understanding the phrase in these multiple instances of it in Romans. But with that said, I would say that we've got to understand the question that begins Romans 4:1 as implying that Paul and the recipients of the letter have not found Abraham to be their father according to the flesh, but according to faith. And basically, I think that is a claim that the way by which Abraham came into the promise that he received from God and began to live out the inheritance of that promise was not by fulfilling a condition that God set for Abraham to be displayed in the flesh of Abraham, such as circumcision, but instead was a gift of God, an expression of God's faith that inspired the trust of Abraham. And that makes the faith of Abraham itself a gift. So while it is true that there might be a way of connecting Paul's relatives and Paul himself to Abraham according to the flesh in the way that I present in the chapter that you read, I don't think that Paul wants to assert the fatherhood of Abraham according to the flesh, because he's talking about how to inherit, how the people of God inherit what was promised to Abraham, and it's not according to flesh, but according to faith. So that's how I would understand what he's talking about there in Romans 4:1 and following. So I guess maybe to sum it up, it's not to deny that there might be a fatherhood of Abraham that takes place according to the flesh over generations, in the same way that Paul is related to the readers, or excuse me, not the readers, his relatives according to the flesh. The Messiah is related to those relatives according to the flesh, as the son of David according to the flesh. But that sort of mode of relation, kind of measurable bonds of connection in the flesh over time, cannot actually account for the power of God's salvation and the way that it finds fulfillment. And so that's in my mind what we have to keep in mind in making sense of this phrase. Great question. What exactly does Paul grieve for? I think that what Paul is grieving over is probably not quite what Eliot is saying. I think it is more that he's grieving over their not enjoying the blessings that they have been promised, which means some real consequences and difficulties in their lives. And also they're becoming enemies of what is actually promised to them. Enemies of people like the audience of the letter, when in fact God has empowered them to be friends. That's what I think he's grieving over myself. I think that's kind of what fits the flow of the argument in Romans. And finally, I guess I've already addressed your fourth question a little bit, Yu-Hui. I think we probably can look to places in Israel's past where they have pursued the promised justice by works rather than by faith. But as I said, I don't think that's actually what Paul is implying. I think he's simply drawing on the character of Israel in certain literary contexts of the scripture to make sense of what's happening with his relatives. But that, of course, implies that there is some correspondence to things that have happened in Israel's past. And I guess I can think of many kind of episodes of Israel's life where a ruler or the people are condemned, judged, because of what they are doing. And we could call it pursuing their promised future according to works rather than according to faith. The thing that's kind of weird about that is usually when they're condemned, it's not for trying to pursue the justice of God with zeal, as Paul says of his relatives. It's for not even trying to pursue the justice of God at all, but actually finding themselves serving other gods and goals that are at odds with what God has called Israel to be. So that means we have to look a little harder, I think, for how we might interpret episodes in Israel's past as cases of seeking the justice that has been promised according to works rather than according to faith. And if I had to look for some of those, can maybe think about David's taking a census, thinking that he's going to secure the future of the people by counting them, especially for military strength. And that's, of course, something that is condemned. You could maybe think of what Aaron does in making a golden calf. Of course, that requires some interpretation that we might neglect, but Aaron doesn't say that's another god. When Aaron finishes making the calf, Aaron says, "This is the God that brought you up out of Egypt." But the point is that Aaron tries to give a sort of visible form to what the people desperately desire and can't find, which is assurance that the God that has rescued them from Egypt is still with them when Moses is gone and they're not sure if he's coming back and they're exposed out there in the middle of the desert. So it's the thing that I'm trying to sort of hold together is that what Paul says in describing his relatives is that they really do have zeal for God, for the God of Israel, that they really are pursuing the justice that has been promised, rather than something else. But the way that they're going about it sort of misunderstands how that justice comes as a gift of the faith of God that inspires the answer of faith in the human and is a humble trust rather than something that accumulates visible credentials and uses those as a kind of mode of power and even a basis for boasting or laying claim to others, against others. So that's kind of how I would try to get at that, rather than just thinking about, general episodes of failure in Israel's past, which I don't think would fit Paul's description here. Thanks again, Yuhei, for some great questions, and to all of you for some good responses this week. Hope this reply from me is helpful to you.